Right. Okay, thank you. So yes, I'm Tim Perry. I work at a company called Softwire, and I want to talk a bit about web components and microservices. So this is going to be a double-length talk, which is going to be quite interesting. And I want to give a little bit of an introduction to both of these in here. Web components in the first half, and then we're going to look at microservices in the second. And then look at some of the interesting similarities and why I care about the kind of underlying concepts that are driving these together. This is going to be quite code-heavy in parts. We're also going to be trying to really focus on this as an introduction. I'm looking at the concepts. I'm looking at why this might be interesting, why this is stuff you might want to care about, not so much about what you should do to get started on it tomorrow. So for a bit of context, Softwire, has anybody ever heard of Softwire? One. Yes. So we're a bespoke software development consultancy up in Kentish Town and Bristol. So we're building software for other people. This is a huge range of stuff, but nowadays a lot of this is on the web because the internet has become quite popular, and there's a lot of JavaScript in this. So a lot of web front ends, quite a few node back ends nowadays. And we've been trying to find ways to manage complexity within these systems, both building complicated web UIs, and then also building more complex architectures and being able to scale this kind of thing up and make this work. And this is what we've been using web components and microservices towards in various stages. So we'll start with web components, which have not loaded correctly because we don't have any internet. But let's just refresh and, oh shit, there we go. Great. So web components are solving a specific problem. And I think the best example of this problem is Bootstrap, which people may be familiar with. This is the nav bar from Bootstrap. So Bootstrap is a library that gives you a whole bundle of these generic widgets so that you can drop in a nav bar that sort of looks okay and out of the box gives you a bit of UI that you can build your website from. This is very nice, it's very convenient, but if you want to add this to your web application, you have to paste this into it. This enormous mess of HTML you don't care about or understand. I don't want to build websites by copying and pasting other people's code into them. I don't want to have to read through my page and read a whole pile of nested divs and junk to work out what on earth is actually going on. And instead, I would really like my page to look more like this. To say, I have a nav bar, and it contains this content, this bit of content that was carefully hidden away in the nest of irrelevant stuff on the previous slide. And this is what web components are trying to let us do. They're trying to encapsulate away that irrelevant behavior or appearance and just say, this is a nav bar. Somebody else has dealt with styling, managing, all of that kind of thing, and all this is what you're saying. You want to build a domain language to be able to accurately describe your page in this kind of way. So this actually, in practice, consists of 4 new specifications from the W3C, a new template tag, HTML imports, the shadow DOM, and custom elements themselves. So we're going to go through these. Firstly, the template tag. Is that readable at the back? Yeah? No? Yeah? No? Yeah. So this, if it stays, which it will not, okay, I'm going to hold this, does exactly nothing. This tag defines a bunch of DOM content which get passed and managed by the browser, but is inert. So it doesn't appear on your page, images don't get loaded, scripts don't get run, styles don't get applied. But it allows you to build chunks of DOM ready to be put into your page that you don't have to worry about interacting with real things. So in JavaScript frameworks at the moment, you typically either put in a div that you style out, display none or whatever, and then copy into various places in your page for templates, or you put it in a script and say type text HTML, and the browser ignores it, and your JavaScript framework passes it for you and puts it in, and so on. And you can't get syntax highlighting on this and this kind of things, and this becomes a hassle. So this is now a first-class feature of browsers. You can put in a template tag. It will get these nodes entirely ready to be put into the page, but not actually do it for you. And you can then very easily grab the content of this DOM node, copy it, and directly put it into the page. This is mostly useful if you're building a JavaScript framework. But it's going to be useful if you're using them because we've removed now a substantial part of the complexity of managing this kind of thing from these frameworks. And you get performance boosts because this is now built into native browsers. And generally, this starts to give us some structure that lets us build larger components ourselves and more easily put this kind of thing together. Right. Next up, we have HTML imports, he says confidently. I really don't want to hold this. All right, so HTML imports allow us to import other bits of content. So you can have a link tag now with rel equals import, reference some other HTML file, and that HTML file and any resources referenced by that HTML file are loaded in. Content within that HTML file becomes accessible through JavaScript, although it doesn't actually appear on your page. Styles do then get applied to the whole page, and scripts get run. This doesn't sound like it would be immediately useful, but all of a sudden allows you to do bundling. You can reference a single file which defines a component and the script associated with it, or the style associated with it, and a bit of templates associated with it, and pull them all in one go with a single line. And this both works for your own files and also for other files on the internet. You can pull in Bootstrap and the selection of CSS and scripts associated with it in one single import, which is quite nice. So next up we have the shadow DOM, and this is going to require 2 hands. So for a while now, browser vendors have been adding some critically important features to browsers, such as the HTML5 video tag. And in the process of implementing this, they've needed a UI framework that allows you to build things like this play button, the scroll bars across the bottom, this kind of thing, so that they can quickly put together this kind of UI. To do that, they needed a convenient layout language in which you can define these kind of UI components that you could easily build and would run cross-platform for this browser wherever. And the obvious choice for that is HTML. These are browser developers. They are very familiar with HTML. It's an easy standard for this kind of thing. But if you put a video tag in your page, the browser can't secretly add a bunch of HTML inside it. It needs to just look like a video tag. It needs to be simple and transparent to you. So to do this, browser vendors needed some way of putting content into your page for you that you couldn't see, that was encapsulated away from you. And that is what the shadow DOM is. And we can actually take a look at this. If we inspect element on here, so this is just the current version of Chrome, we see that this video tag is a plain standard video tag. If you then go into the settings and tick show user agent shadow DOM, all of a sudden, this is not a plain video tag and is suddenly expandable. We can go into the shadow root within it and see a div, and there's a button in here, and actually it turns out there's some more buttons, and there's a range, and so on and so on. And this is how these things are being built. This lets you provide chunks of DOM within the page that are isolated from the rest of the page, where isolated means styles from the surrounding page do not affect them, so they're isolated in appearance, and JavaScript iterating over DOM nodes will never see them. There's some new APIs that let you dig in, but by and large, they're essentially invisible. If you iterate through this page, you just see an empty video tag and nothing more. And this is interesting because this is now a feature that you can use too. So you can build your own chunks of page isolated from one another. You can build bits of page that are not affected by the CSS on the rest of the page, and by default are not visible to the JavaScript in the rest of the page. And the actual code to do this looks like this. You define a div, you grab the div, and you say, I want a shadow root within it, and then you set some content within that shadow root. The content redefines the presentation of that element. So here, this DOM invisible headline is this code. Here, the irrelevant content never appears. All you see as a user looking at the page is the content of the shadow root, and all you see as JavaScript running within the page is the original content. So we're redefining the presentation of this element entirely, invisibly to the rest of the page in an isolated, encapsulated manner. More interestingly, though, you can parameterize that new presentation with the original content. And that's what we're doing here. And that's what we're doing here. So there's a content tag that you can place within your shadow root that looks like this, which essentially gets replaced by the content of the hosting element. Yeah, it's been doing that. There we go. I'm just going to hold it. It'll be fine. I'll remember. So the content tag, that would be very useful. The content tag within this gets replaced by the content for the hosting element. Yeah, it just seems that bit. So that the originally real content here comes from the originally within our inner HTML, and also the actual real content, the original thing. So now we can take a bunch of content, we can wrap it in some new HTML, some new styling, we can add extra behavior to it, and to the rest of the page it just looks like the original content we were given. But to the user, you can totally represent it. You can totally change how that looks and how that works. And let's see how this works. Finally, the fourth of these specs is custom elements. This, again, does nothing. Here we've defined a new element, but we haven't defined anything about it. So when we use it in the page, although this navbar DOM node is an instance of a new node that we've created, that's not worked. Although it is an instance of the new node we've created, it doesn't actually have anything associated with it. Any minute now. Coming back to this then, this does nothing. What would be interesting would be if we could add elements to the page that did things. This does a little thing. So here, rather than just registering an element, we register an element with a prototype based on the base HTML element, and we add this update content method to it. And that, all of a sudden, is available within the DOM. You can just go to this node and call update content. You can change lists, so they have a delete empty node thing that gets rid of, like, finished to-do items or something, this kind of thing. You can build content fundamentally into the actual elements within your page. This gets more interesting if they get called by somebody else. So these callbacks automatically get called by the browser when you create your element or attach it or detach it from the page or whenever any of the attributes change. And all of a sudden you can have an element within your page that reacts automatically to your behavior. As soon as you put it in, it could automatically change its content. For example, it can add its own styles. If you set certain attributes, it can delete everything within it, all sorts of stuff. So we can build behavior on top of these, and we can add a certain layer of control. And hopefully you can start to see how this comes together as we come back round to Bootstrap itself and what we're sort of aiming for here. So we want to have this navbar element that just takes an actual definition of the real content within it and then represents it, restyles it, and allows us to just kind of drop this into new pages. And the actual code for this essentially looks like this. So you'd HTML import this entire page, which defines the whole thing. You have a template tag that contains all the Bootstrap rubbish that you don't care about, and a content tag in the middle that defines the actual, that is where the actual content becomes placed. And then within the same HTML file, you have a script that says when I create my navbar, grab the template and put it inside a shadow root inside the navbar element. And then you register this. And if you add a navbar to your page now with a bunch of links in it, a shadow root will be created, all the Bootstrap stuff will be done there, and your original links will essentially be dropped into the Bootstrap code. You never see Bootstrap. You never have to deal with it when you're iterating over your code. If you look at your HTML, it just says, I have a menu here with a bunch of links in it. But all of a sudden, you've represented this. You've built structure on top, design on top. And so finally, just for this first session, I want to take a little bit of a look at this in action. And the code for this is up on GitHub. I've got a thrilling example website here that I've stuck together that allows you to compare different things. This is essentially all vanilla JavaScript under the hood. There's a little bit of knockout I'm using to manage dynamic updating of various bits of the page. But the static site itself is all web components, and this is running in the newest Chrome. If you were trying to describe the page, you might say that it has a top header which has some title text and some login fields, and then it's got a series of these lozenges with banners and a series of items within them, and an add facet and an add lozenge blob here. And that, very conveniently, is essentially what the HTML looks like if we ignore some of the knockout attributes. So we have a fixed header element that contains a title and a user login element. We have a list of lozenges, which contains some lozenges and some banners and some individual items. And there's attributes and things we're using to communicate and manage the dynamic structure in here. But fundamentally, the actual HTML now accurately describes how you would describe the page. You've moved to a place where you've got this language that you can use to build pages that matches how you would actually think about them, rather than this being many, many layers of nested divs. Where this gets really interesting is how these elements interact. So to set any content in them, you just put text within them, and that gets restyled and managed for you. But the user login element, for example, is doing login for us internally. All I do here is drop this user login element into the page, and then using knockout subscribe to log in and log out events, in the same way that on a button you might subscribe to click events. And I get a login, log out event fired automatically when login happens. And that's all I have to do. Everything else remains encapsulated and isolated in here. If I rewrite this login element to do two-factor authentication or to log in with Facebook or anything else, I know nothing else is going to break. Everything else is isolated from that. All it does is listen for login events. And we've got these independent components now that we can move around, we can drop in and out with confidence that they're not going to break each other because things remain encapsulated, separated from one another. And we build communication over the top through standard DOM mechanisms, standard events, attributes, and content and thing. And this already works very well with code you're already using. Everything already understands the DOM. Chrome will let me set breakpoints on login events, these kinds of things. Everything just already works. So, to wrap up for this section, can you actually use this? No, essentially. So, templates is final. The draft is finished. It is complete. The others are in late-stage draft. They're unlikely to change drastically at all. They're essentially final, but that's not actually confirmed yet. All of this is implemented and working very nicely in the most recent versions of Chrome and Opera. It's also essentially working in Firefox, but they've put everything that isn't final behind a flag that you have to explicitly go and turn on. And Safari have only implemented templates, and IE have barely started, in a surprising twist. So there's no immediate time frame for those yet, so that's going to be a bit of a blocker for using this kind of out of the box. But polyfills exist that will take this right the way back to IE9, for starters, if you want to use this exactly as is. On top of that, there's a lot of libraries now moving towards using this as a pattern, and this is very much the way we've been using it primarily. So Ember, for example, Ember components are now a big and growing core part of how you write Ember. Angular 2 is based entirely around components. Knockout has a component system built in. Basically, everything is moving in this kind of direction, building these same patterns. And it's exactly the same structure that you then swap out for the native APIs once they're actually implemented and available. But moving towards this pattern puts you in the right kind of place. And this is getting driven fairly heavily, both by the Chrome team and by Firefox, and at this stage is fairly inevitably, and in a very positive way, the future of building these kind of web applications. It's pretty much everywhere, and it's coming forwards really quite quickly now. So that's everything I've got for this first section. I think we're having a break now before we get into microservices, but I'll be wandering around for questions potentially, or I'll be in for questions in the pub straight after this. Thank you.